Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen. Before we begin, I'm going to ask you to do something. This is the interactive part. You can go to sleep for the rest of the time. But what I'd like to do is, before I begin, I'd just like you to do me a short favor. I'd like you to take a piece of paper and a pen, and on that piece of paper with that pen, I'd like you to write down up to 5 things that you associate with dyslexia, or that you think dyslexia might be. So something like, you might want to write down something like gets B's and D's the wrong way around, that kind of thing. So just 5 of those, and I'll just give you slightly less than a minute, or about a minute, to do that. Thank you very much. And you'll see why I'm doing this. It gives me an idea of what we think about dyslexia. Right. Now, I don't expect everyone to get all 5, but if you can just write a couple down, it'd be really nice. And there's a reason that I'm asking this. Hello, let's see if we've got any chats. Brilliant. Yep, the wrong order letter, jumping lines while reading, all this kind of stuff. This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Right. Now, you don't have to write these in the box. I'm going to come back to it later on. But it is quite important that we understand what we're talking about, because I'm going to make a bold claim to begin with. And this bold claim is that the chances are almost everybody who writes something about dyslexia, or almost everybody who says anything about dyslexia, is talking about something slightly different. And the research is quite clear on this. This is quite interesting. So I'm just going to show you this. Where are we? There we go. I'm just going to show you this. There was a survey done a couple of years ago, and the links to all of these are in the PowerPoint at the end. There's a references section, so if you want to see the links, you can do. It turns out that teachers were polled on what they identified dyslexia as. 79.5% identified dyslexia as behavioral characteristics, things like getting words in the wrong order, mixing up letters, that kind of thing. 39.3% identified dyslexia by cognitive characteristics. That is, finding reading difficult, processing the sounds of language, that kind of thing. 16.8% identified dyslexia by visual characteristics, things like seeing words in the wrong order, that kind of thing, reading some words the wrong way around, as one of the people have just texted. 9% identified dyslexia by biological characteristics, the shape of the brain. And this is really interesting. So these percentages, they show that lots of different teachers understand dyslexia differently. Very few of them see it as a biological characteristic first and foremost. Now, this is hardly surprising. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you out 5. This is just 5 of the main categories, or rather the main descriptions of what dyslexia is. So the Rose Report is what the British government accepts as the definition of dyslexia. And if you go to state schools in Britain, they use the Rose Report as the standard understanding of what dyslexia is. And the Rose Report says that dyslexia is difficulties in phonological awareness, verbal memory, and verbal processing speed. If you go to the British Dyslexia Association, they say it is a neurological difference, and then they talk about fluent word recognition later on. If you go to the British Psychological Society, and these are a lot of the people who diagnose and identify and assess for dyslexia, they call it accurate and fluent word reading and or spelling develops incompletely or with very great difficulty. If you go to the European Dyslexia Association, which is a conglomerate of dyslexia associations based in Brussels, they say it's a disorder mainly characterized by severe difficulties in acquiring reading, spelling, and writing skills. If you then go over to, I think it's Oregon, it's based in the International Dyslexia Association, they call it a neurologically based condition that affects reading accuracy, reading fluency, and spelling, an unexpected difficulty in learning to read. Now, if anyone here is thinking that actually these are all the same description in slightly different words, I'm going to translate. So anyone who's really deep down and swimming in the waters of dyslexia awareness, you'll recognize that the Rose Report thinks of it as experiential and phonological. The British Dyslexia Association characterizes it as neurological. The British Psychological Society characterizes it as developmental. The European Dyslexia Association characterizes it as acquisitional and literacy. And the International Dyslexia Association characterizes it as neurological. So you've got kind of 5 different characterizations. Within that, you can look deeper at how they characterize it. So the Rose Report is phonological and experiential difficulties. The British Dyslexia Association is neurological differences. The British Psychological Society, developmental difficulties and developmental incompleteness. The European Dyslexia Association calls it a literacy acquisition disorder. And the International Dyslexia Association calls it neurological literacy difficulties. So we can see just by looking at this that the chances are that very few people actually have a really good idea of dyslexia, because all of the governing bodies call it something different. It's like they're all talking about something completely different when they talk about dyslexia. I'm involved in a project to try to find out if there is one understanding that all of these bodies can come up with. It's hardly surprising, because when we talk about dyslexia, I mean, I've given a wheel here, and it's like 7, 8 different things on this wheel. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different things on this wheel. I'd call this large D dyslexia. When we talk about dyslexia, people talk about dyslexia, dysnomia, dysphonia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dysorthography. And so there's at least, I mean, this is just what's filled the wheel. I could have gone on. But when you look at that, we'll take one of them, we'll take dyslexia. And in dyslexia, we find that, if you like, there's perceptual dyslexia, there's linguistic dyslexia, phonological, visual service dyslexia, rapid naming deficit, double deficit. And if you take this, you could just take one of these subsections and subdivide it again into acquired environmental dyslexia, developmental dyslexia, or post-trauma dyslexia. Go back, and it doesn't only work for dyslexia, it works for others. So I've just done dyscalculia as well. So we've got qualitative, asemantic, quantitative, sequential, oligocalculia, operational, practognostic. You don't need to know what these are, by the way. Look at practognostic, and you've got developmental, post-trauma, acquired. You don't need to know what these are. But what it does is it shows us the difficulties in understanding what dyslexia is. And I'm going to show you very clearly what dyslexia is in the course of this little talk, and hopefully it'll become quite clear for you. It doesn't get any easier, because if you go into many Dyslexia Association websites, and this is just taken from a very, very well-respected Dyslexia Association website. If you go to Dyslexia Association websites, you will see things like moving words, shaking words. Words are fuzzy, words are distorted, they pulse, they float, that kind of thing. And it doesn't make an awful lot of sense to an awful lot of people. So what I'm going to do to begin with is I'm just going to explain what it might mean to have moving words. So I'm going to show you something. And what I'm going to show you, the image I'm going to show you is perfectly still, completely still. There's no movement in this image, okay? Let's have a look at this. Now, what I'd like you to do is type into the chat, do you see movement or do you not see movement? Well, I get slightly sozzled on wine. Yeah, you see, a lot of people are going to start seeing movement here. Absolutely. You see movement, but if you put your hand on the screen, those people who see movement, if you put your hand on the screen, there's no movement at all. Some do and some don't. And this is what's really interesting. Here's another one. Here's a competition. Count the black dots. How many black dots are there? Yeah, it's not so easy, is it? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically induce what they call visual dyslexia in some of you. Now, before I do this, I'm just going to say, if anybody has, what do we call it? If anybody has photosensitive epilepsy, you can choose not to look at this, okay? Almost certainly, there's no problem. Almost certainly, there'll be no problem. There was one case a few years ago of something a little bit like this, when somebody with photosensitive epilepsy had a seizure, but we don't know whether it was connected, and it's only one case. So if you have photosensitive epilepsy, you can choose not to do this. Everybody else, I'd like you to do this. So first of all, you all wrote down on a piece of paper some things that you associate with dyslexia. Can you take that piece of paper and look at it, please? Okay, so you've taken the piece of paper, you've looked at it, you've reminded yourself of what your own handwriting looks like. Now, what I'm going to do is ask you to look back at the screen. and look at the spiral on the screen. Follow my instructions to the letter. Look at the center of the spiral. Do not look away from the center of the spiral. Now, this spiral is going to move, and I'm just going to ask you to focus on the center just for a few seconds. Not for very long. It's not going to do any harm. And by the way, as you're focusing and the spiral's moving, I want you to think about giving me your bank account details as I'm going to start to hypnotizing you. I'm not at all. But look at the center, focus on the center just for a few more seconds. And at some point, I'm going to say stop. And when I say stop, I want you to look back at what you wrote on your piece of paper, but not yet. I just want you to keep looking at the center of the spirals, okay? In about 5 seconds, I'm going to say stop, and I'm going to ask you to look back at what you wrote on your piece of paper. In about 4 seconds, so prepare. Make sure that you're staring at the center of the spirals. 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1. Stop and look back at what you wrote on your piece of paper, please. Now, I don't know how many of you see the words moving on a piece of paper. But if you do, this is what people call visual dyslexia. Anybody see the words moving? No? No? Some people, looks like some people don't. They didn't. Oh, I'm really sorry. If they didn't, it's horrifying because it's one of these great things. And if it does move, it's a beautiful thing. For those of you for whom it did move, everyone's saying no. You must be really, really neurologically different because for everybody else, not that it matters that much. Not that it matters that much. Some of them are still moving. But for those of you for whom it is still moving, you'll stay like this forever. And I don't know, I should have mentioned that before I did this. Yeah, words sort of leaned in. The rate of animation was an issue, was it? Okay, could have been. It's because the spiral animation was laggy. Could have been. Okay, right. One of the reasons I did this was to show what people call visual dyslexia. But the thing is, visual dyslexia is not dyslexia. And when people say that this is what dyslexia is, it's words moving or it's still images moving, they're actually not being accurate. It's something called Myers-Irlen syndrome or Irlen syndrome. The figures are somewhere between 32 and 48% of the population of people with dyslexia have got Irlen syndrome. So I've got Irlen syndrome. I see things moving, but it's not dyslexia. It's a visual processing issue, and it's not dyslexia. And this is the thing, because when we teach people what dyslexia is, and we teach them badly what dyslexia is, and when we give them false information, absolutely, I can write, yeah, Irlen syndrome. When we give them this false information about what dyslexia is, what we're doing is we're misleading people, because Irlen syndrome is a visual processing problem. It's not a cognitive thing. And when we mislead people, this is really key. I don't know whether anybody knows, but we are in the middle of Mental Health Awareness Week. And those people with dyslexia who are not recognized, those people with dyslexia who are not properly served, here are the statistics. This is fascinating and it's absolutely vital. This is why we talk about dyslexia awareness. It's not a piece of academic interest. This is really important. 82% of dyslexic children try to hide their difficulties at school. We know this for a fact. We also know that 52% of dyslexic children try to avoid school. We also know that the inability to read, this is fascinating research, the inability to read shares the same levels of shame as incest. Now, I don't know whether you knew that, but this is really, really important. There's a very, very famous piece of research that demonstrates this very clearly. We also know that people with dyslexia are twice as likely as those without dyslexia to become homeless. We also know that 50% of those in drug and alcohol rehabilitation are dyslexic. 50% of them in drug and alcohol rehabilitation are dyslexic. 63% of dyslexics had criminal convictions by the age of 24. 85% had attempted self-harm. And perhaps most shocking of all, if you're dyslexic, you get a 46% raised chance of attempted suicide. Now, when we talk about dyslexia awareness, we are not talking solely about how to improve results. We are talking about the lives of students. This is really interesting. I run a project called Dyslexia Bites, and I try to understand dyslexia from an intercultural perspective. I'm going off piece for a little bit here, but this is Really important. I do interviews with people from all around the world, educators and dyslexia specialists from all around the world. I did an interview with a very interesting Korean woman. She's naturalized German, called Pia Young Lampert, and she has told me that there is a bridge in Seoul, in Korea. There is a bridge. And on this bridge, there are pictures of teddy bears and dogs and puppies to stop children throwing themselves off to their death, because their education system does not cater for people who think differerly. Their education system does not cater for those of us who think slightly differently from the normal, from the norm. Korea likes standardization. It likes, as it were, cohesion in society, and that's perfectly understandable. But when you have an education system that does that, what it does is it drives children to suicide. 15 to 24 years old, that age group, one of the highest rates of death is child suicide. And it's because we are not understanding dyslexia properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a quick look at this. You may be part of the reason that we don't understand dyslexia properly. At the beginning of this session, I'm going to do something horrible to you now, okay? I'm going to do something horrible. At the beginning of this session, I asked you to write 5 things down that you associate with dyslexia, okay? I'd like you to return to those things you've written down, and we're going to run a poll, okay? We're going to run a poll. I'm going to create a world of black and white, a world of left and right, of up and down, a world of binary opposites. There is only positive and there is only negative in this world. So if you wrote something like slow reading or gets words the wrong way around, that's negative. If you wrote, as somebody said, something like overachievers, that's positive. What I want you to do is count up the number of negative things you said, count up the number of positive things you said, and we're going to run a poll. I believe that, James, you can control this poll, or somebody can. And in this poll, I want you to write the number of things you wrote. Do they add up as positive? Do they add up as negative? Or do they add up as neutral? Let's have a look. Can you write down in your poll? Interesting. This is interesting. Look at this, 70% negative, 70% negative. This isn't having a go at anybody, by the way. When I do this, this isn't having a go at anybody. This is you are, if you like, the cream of the crop. By being here at a dyslexia awareness sort of talk, you're the ones who want to find out. You're the ones who are at the vanguard, and you're doing something really positive. And yet, even among the positive people, we've still got a 70% negative perception of what dyslexia is. It's absolutely shocking, isn't it? 72% negative perception of what dyslexia is. And in fact, to give you some heart, because I know that it might shock you, there was a recent poll run this year Made by Dyslexia, a really large organization, that showed only 3% of the population had a positive view of dyslexia. 3% of the population had a positive view of dyslexia. So the fact that we've got only 70 with a negative view, it might sound shocking, but it's actually, we are in the positive vanguard. And so what we need to do is we need to start looking at what dyslexia really is. I created this underground map called the Dyslexia Underground. And I like the Dyslexia Underground to, I think we should name it. Somebody said maybe we should name it. We should. If you think about it, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, dysnomia, dysphasia, they begin with dys. They begin with inability. They begin with can't. We are labeling children from a really early age by what they cannot do. And it's a moral crime, quite frankly. It's an absolute moral crime. Whereas if we look at what dyslexia really is, it's a complexity. It's a crisscross of a number of different ideas. So let me go through these very quickly. Phonology, sorry, my dyslexia coming out. Phonology, translating written words into sounds. That is, when you read a word, do you know what it sounds like in your head? Working memory. Now, this is really, really key. You're all teachers here, and this is something which we should really, really think about. Working memory, here's a very good definition of working memory. The ability to take something that you've just read or heard and then recall it and apply it. That's working memory, Okay, now this is really interesting because how many of you, think about it, how many of you, when you're teaching grammar, you teach people rules and then you expect them to recall the rules and apply the rules of grammar? This is how you use the present perfect. This is how you use the present continuous. This is how you use, the difference between at, on, and in. And then you expect people to recall those rules and apply them. This is effectively putting pressure on working memory. And working memory is something that the majority of people with dyslexia struggle with. I have terrible working memory problems. And so instead of telling me a rule and then telling me to remember it and apply it, what we need to do is we need to be constructivist about it. We need to say, okay, here's a load of examples of the preposition about. Here's 20 examples of when we use the preposition about. Tell me what you think they've all got in common. Create yourself a rule. And when we don't give people rules and tell them to remember them and apply them, when we say, okay, create the rules yourself, be constructivist about this, when we take this kind of non-absolutist view of grammar, then we're bypassing working memory issues. We're bypassing this very thing that people with dyslexia struggle with. Sequencing, the ability to tell your left from your right, is a really big thing in dyslexia. I've been sacked from waitering jobs because I keep putting the knives and the forks on the wrong side of the table. The ability to count backwards, that kind of thing. The ability to see which order something goes in. This is sequencing. People with dyslexia sequence eccentrically. Convergence, fascinating stuff. Most people, when they read from left to right in a zigzag, and they focus 3 to 4 times a second reasonably regularly as they're reading. People with dyslexia don't. We don't read in a zigzag. Our focus is not regular. We focus for longer periods of time on some parts of the words and less period of time on other parts of the words. And so what we need to do is we need to reduce the amount of text we're giving. This is the key thing, reduce the amount of text. Executive function. Most people who don't have dyslexia have what I call a personal assistant or a secretary living inside them. This personal assistant can prioritize, can put things in different order, can say, okay, you've stopped doing that now it's time to do this. You've stopped doing that, now it's time to do this. And they can regulate your emotions while they're doing so. This is what executive functioning is. If you want to bypass executive functioning problems, it's really, really simple. Make your instructions simple. One instruction at a time. And make sure that when you've got an instruction, how many instructions are embedded in that instruction? So a lot of the time, our instructions maybe seem like one instruction, but it's really 10 instructions embedded inside one instruction. So keep your instructions simple. KISS, K-I-S-S. Keep it short and simple with your instructions. Here's one thing to do. Done it? Great. Now let's do something else. This gets past executive function. Now, then there's creativity, there's material reasoning, and there's visual thinking. These things go very, very closely together indeed. Dyslexic people are definitely more creative than non-dyslexic people. And this isn't just being kind to dyslexics, by the way. I'm going to show you why. I'm going to show you exactly what we mean by dyslexics being creative in a second. But what we can do is we can split it so that we've got the negatives, you might call them negatives or whatever language you use, and you've got something more positive, okay? So the negatives, not really negatives, the challenges. Phonological processing, reduce the amount of text. Executive function, make instructions really clear. Sequencing, make sure that you do one thing and then another thing and then another. And then with working memory, don't give people rules and tell them to apply the rules, because that's putting undue stress on working memory. The positives are creativity, global holistic reasoning, we'll come to this in a second, and visual thinking. When I say visual thinking, by the way, I'm not doing that old chestnut of visual learners and kinesthetic learners. I'm not doing that. I don't believe in that. I mean something specific and something very different from these old sort of learning style. I don't mean that kind of thing. So let's have a look. I'm going to show you what it's like being dyslexic in reality. This is what it happens when phonological processing, that is reading things and understanding what they are in your head. Phonological processing meets visual stress, meets executive function, meets working memory, meets sequencing, meets convergence. So I'm going to ask you to copy something for me. So can you get that piece of paper and a pen again? I would be very grateful indeed. You get a piece of paper and a pen. And as you get your piece of paper and a pen, I'd like you to copy something. The person who completes this first gets a prize. Okay, the person who completes this first gets a bottle of champagne. How about that? Sounds good, doesn't it? Right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to copy this. Don't start yet, don't cheat, no cheating. I'm going to ask you to copy this. And then when I say stop, if anybody has completed it, you get a bottle of champagne. Okay, so in 3, in 2, in 1, I'm going to ask you to copy, go. And while you're doing this, I'm going to speak, because this is phonological processing. When you're reading things and you can't hear them in your head, this is phonological processing. So while I'm speaking, you're trying to read this. And I'm not serious, by the way. I don't expect you to do that. It's horrible. But by the way, if you ever, as a teacher, if you ever ask people with dyslexia to copy, that's what you're putting them through. That's what we're putting people through. And we ask people to copy. You won. I shall share some champagne with you. This is what we're putting people through when they ask them to copy. And it's horrendous because I can't copy. By the time I've looked at something on the board or on a page in a book and it's got to the page on my piece of paper, I've forgotten it. Honestly, I have. And this is not because I'm particularly unintelligent, by the way. I mean, I'm not the brightest tool in the breadbasket. That's absolutely true. But I'm not massively unintelligent. I'm about to complete my PhD. So if you like, the fact that I can't do this isn't a reflection on my intelligence. It's a reflection on particular cognitive skills that we want to try to take the pressure off. So let's have a quick look. What actually helps dyslexic students learn? So I mentioned creativity a little bit earlier. We need to introduce more creativity into the learning environment. What do we mean by that? Well, very, very simple. First of all, some proof that dyslexic people are creative. You hear people saying dyslexic people are creative, and it just sounds a little bit patronizing, to be honest with you, but it's true. There have been many, many studies. There are studies that have found a link between dyslexia and creativity. One study showed that junior high school students who were diagnosed with dyslexia performed significantly better in a well-known psychological creativity test, the Wechsler test, than their non-dyslexic counterparts. In 1979 study, a different study of the creative potential of people with dyslexia found that people with dyslexia are able to learn and remember secondary information easily, a capacity linked to creativity. Secondary information, by the way, just to tell you what it is, when you give people a lot of information, primary information is what you want them to remember, and secondary information is what I remember. Effectively, that's what secondary information is. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Dyslexia and bilingualism are really, really closely linked. People with dyslexia find it easier to become bilingual, believe it or not. And there's this really In one 1992 study, a positive relationship between creativity and interpersonal problem solving was found in dyslexic subjects. Higher scores in verbal fluency were associated with a better ability to analyze a problem, generate alternative solutions, and foresee the consequences to the solution that was chosen. When I've done my dyslexia test, and I've been assessed, diagnostically assessed twice, I come out in the top 0.05 percentile of people with verbal intelligence, but quite low down in different kinds of intelligence. So this kind of, which kind of intelligence are we looking for is quite important. 20 years ago, the Central St. Martin's School of Art and Design funded research into the link between creativity and dyslexia. Dr. Beverly Stefert found 3/4 of their 360 foundation students, that's nearly 100 students out of 360, had dyslexia. They found that there seems to be a trade-off between being able to see the world vividly and three-dimensionally, which we'll come to in a second, and processing written words through reading and writing. And finally, creativity in dyslexic and non-dyslexic children in France and Belgium was evaluated with the Torrance test of creative thinking. I love the Torrance test. It's one of my favorite tests. Children with dyslexia showed higher creativity scores than non-dyslexic participants. Importantly, it was also found that educational approaches could improve the creative scores in dyslexia even further, matching these students with students from arts universities. I mean, this is incredible. This is young children who were as creative as students in arts universities. And this is what dyslexia is. It is hardwired to be creative. Now, I'm not going to read too much of this, but there was a report recently by consultancy firm EY that found that dyslexic skills are aligned with the skills that will be required in the workplaces of the future. Referencing the prediction of which skills will be the most in demand by 2022, EY's report highlighted how certain capabilities were becoming more or less useful to employers with the rise of automation. The need for processing and manual capabilities like time management, reading and maths, those things that we with dyslexia find tricky, are on the decline, according to the report. Meanwhile, the report's authors highlighted the capabilities and skills typically seen in people with dyslexia that will be vital to all industries by the year 2022. They included leadership, social influence, creativity, initiative, and idea generation. Jobs in the workplace that dyslexic individuals may typically find challenging will largely be impacted by forms of automation, the report's authors said. Now, this is all very interesting. Words like creativity are kind of vague. There are many different definitions of creativity, but I quite like this one. The ability to design, assemble, construct, conjecture, develop, formulate, author, and investigate, and also instigate. And this, if you notice, it shows that being creative and asking students to be creative isn't an alternative to learning. If anybody is in any way interested in Bloom's taxonomy, it is deep learning. Things like remembering and applying, those working memory things we talked about earlier, these are on the lots, if you like the hots and the lots. I'm not so sure I do. The lower order thinking strategies. The higher order thinking strategies are those things that people with dyslexia are capable of, creating, evaluating, analyzing. So these are the dyslexic skills, and these are what we need to be going for. It's not that it's an alternative to learning, it's that it is deep learning. And that's what we want to really focus on. There was a study as well in the University of Birmingham, and this was very recent. I think it was 2019. They studied a small sample of dyslexic high achievers. There were 50 dyslexic students at the University of Birmingham that they studied. So it's only 50. But they identified 4 specific things that meant that these dyslexic students were successful. Age of identification. And that means that, if you like, the earlier we can spot what dyslexia is, it's not our job to diagnose or assess or screen people, but the earlier we can spot what dyslexia is, the better. Learning resources. Influence of teachers on self-esteem. This is key. And what we call self-identification. Now, when I say self-identification, the University of Birmingham made this quite clear what they meant. They effectively divided self-identification into 4 quadrants. On the left, they are patients and students. Patients believe that dyslexia is viewed as a medical or neurological condition. Students are those who believe that dyslexia is viewed as reading, writing, or learning difficulties. Songs and drawing, very, very close. Those people who are visual learners, they tend to be very sensual learners, if you like. I'm a big believer that there are not just 5 senses as well. So patients and students, those people who view dyslexia as a medical neurological condition or as reading and writing difficulties, which is what most people see dyslexia as, these actually retarded the learning of dyslexic students. The dyslexic students thrived when they became, and those around them became, hemispherists, which is dyslexia is viewed as a difference in learning style, and campaigners, which is that dyslexia is viewed as a political struggle, as in, stop doing that, teacher, you're misserving me. Now, let's have a look at what we mean by hemispherists. I'm just going to show you very quickly a little story I created. And this is me being a little bit dyslexic. So here are 3 worlds. I'd like to tell you a story about 3 worlds, about a benign creator who decided that he wanted to create 3 different worlds in a universe. The first world, he decided, was going to be filled with quite short buildings that are closely packed together, and there were going to be lots of them. And these buildings were closely packed together in what you would call localities. The second world, the buildings were slightly larger and they were slightly further apart. And these were packed together in regions. And in the third world, the buildings were even taller and they were even further apart. And these were more globalized buildings. So in the first world, the buildings are quite small and packed quite tightly together, and there are lots of them. And the second world, not quite as many of them, slightly bigger and not quite as tightly packed. And in the third world, fewer of them, spaced even further apart, and definitely not very tightly packed. Right. If you want to communicate in world number one, what you do is you take your piece of paper and you run up the building, and then you throw it from your building to the next building. They catch the piece of paper, they run down the building, they go to the next building, they run up the stairs, they throw it to the next building, and so on and so on and so forth. This is how people communicate. And because the buildings aren't very, very high, it doesn't take long to get up and down the buildings, and it doesn't take long to throw the information from one building to the next. In the second world, it takes a little longer to get up and down the buildings, and a little longer to throw it from one building to the next, because the buildings are slightly further spaced apart. And as you can probably guess, in the third world, it takes even longer to get up and down the buildings, and it takes longer to throw the piece of paper with the information on it from one building to the next. And the buildings are spaced very far apart, and you're throwing it from one part of the world to the other part of the world. So this is the three worlds story. The benign creator realized that this was three different ways of communicating. There was what you might call the localized way of communicating, the regionalized way of communicating, and the globalized way of communicating. And he realized that bringing these three ways of communicating together was probably the best thing to do in his context or her context. Because we know that diverse cross-functional operations tend to outperform less diverse ones by 30 to 40%. And this is business operations, this is social operations, this is educational operations, this is any operation. Diverse cross-cultural operations, cross-functional operations outperform less diverse operations. We know this. And so the benign creator, what this creator did is he brought these three worlds together into a small universe so that they could all create and they could all interact with each other, because they each had a different benefit. Some of them were good at one thing, some of them were good at another thing. Now, if anyone's wondering why I've sort of veered off the subject of dyslexia and started talking about cosmology or something, you needn't have any worries, because what I'm talking about is something about the brain, something called minicolumns. And this is really, really interesting. In the brain, on the neocortex, the cerebral cortex, you have effectively these stacks of cells. And these stacks of cells are called minicolumns, okay? And minicolumns, you're effectively shooting information up and down these minicolumns and between the minicolumns. And it's one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that the brain, as it were, internally communicates with itself. This is really, really key. And what's happened with these minicolumns is that we can say that the autistic minicolumns are really small. So this is really fascinating. People with autism, their minicolumns are really small, but quite tightly packed together. And what that means is the information rushes up and down them really quickly, and it jumps between them really quickly. It's one of the reasons that autistic people tend to have sensory and cognitive overload from time to time, and we need to calm down the surrounding environment, and why they tend to hyper-focus, but why they're also really quick thinkers. We'll forget the neurotypical one because that's in the middle, but the dyslexic people, our minicolumns as a dyslexic person are really tall, and it means that it takes longer for the information to get up and down. This explains one of the reasons why actually our cognitive processing is a little bit slower than maybe a neurotypical person. But once the information has gone up and down, it's transmitted around, and the minicolumns are spaced further apart. And it means that what happens is we have a more global, holistic way of thinking. Different parts of the brain are interacting with each other, in other words. So the great example is the autistic person is hyper-focused, and the dyslexic person sees connections that other people can't necessarily see. And this is because, or partly because, of these things called minicolumns, which basically populate the outside of your brain. And this is basically the way that our brains are built. And when we start seeing this, we just start seeing dyslexia as a different way of thinking. Linked to this, Linda K. Silverman and Jeffrey Fried studied 200 school children over a 5-year period and found that dyslexic children tend to think in pictures. They want to see the whole picture and see how ideas fit together. And this is this idea of global holistic thinking, as well as, by the way, this visual idea. Yes, a person can be dyslexic and autistic at the same time, because it's not only about the Minicolumns, it's about all sorts of different parts of the brain. So different parts of the brain work together, and when your brain develops, you can be dyslexic, you can be autistic, and in fact, there's an awful lot of comorbidity or co-occurrence in these conditions. We also know, by the way, that researchers at the University of California have demonstrated children with dyslexia have enhanced picture recognition memory. So what we know is we've got this global holistic thinking, we've got this creativity, and it tends to manifest itself in picture thinking and picture learning. And this is a really interesting piece of research as well that shows this. In 2018, an organization called Dyslexic Advantage surveyed 1,100 participants. And they asked a simple question: when I view 3D spatial images in my mind, I can manipulate them and see them from multiple angles. Now, of the dyslexic sample on the left in yellow, those who strongly disagreed, about 5.5% disagreed. And it worked its way up to agreed about 30% and strongly agreed, over 40% of them strongly agreed. The non-dyslexic sample, the blue on the right, you can see it's a mirror image. So they strongly disagreed, 23.6%. They disagreed, 35.8%. They somewhat agree, they agree, and they strongly agree, goes down to about 6%. And what we found, the study after study after study has shown that dyslexic people have got bad working memory. So we've got to stop giving them rules and tell them to remember and apply the rules. They've got high levels of creativity, which is at the top of Bloom's taxonomy for learning. And it means that if they can create their own rules, and if they can link different things together, they will learn. They can see it, so they tend to see in images. And this global holistic thinking means that they tend to see everything as it is together. Now, what do we mean when we talk about visual learning? Well, I'm just going to give you a couple of very simple examples. This is visual learning. When I said, oh, what does it mean to see words moving around on a page? I showed you this. And if anybody thought, oh, right, I get it now, that's visual learning. The Dyslexia Underground map. This is really key. By the way, I'm just going to talk for 1 second about this Underground map. I'm really pleased with this. There's something in the brain called the ventral pathway. There could be two of them. I'm not 100% sure, but there's certainly one, at least one, possibly two ventral pathways. These ventral pathways are key to comprehension. So if your ventral pathways are damaged, it means that you tend to be unable to recognize facial expressions and understand what they mean, for instance. So ventral pathways in your brain are really, really key to understanding, not just reading, but understanding. Now, the key to accessing ventral pathways is to produce images, but images where the message and the images are embedded in each other. So this Dyslexia Underground shows through its imagery the intersection of different aspects of dyslexia. This directly accesses the ventral pathway. It bypasses phonological processing and working memory, and it accesses the very part of the brain that comprehends the information that we give. And so what we need to do is start giving our information in, as it were, in visual form, and where the visuals reflect the message, and the message is reflected in the visuals, such as the Dyslexia Underground. I'll be able to answer questions on this a little bit later on as well. Infographics is an excellent way of doing it. As long as the infographics aren't simply those sort of business infographics where you get like a I don't know, a circle and different things written outside the circle. That doesn't do it. The idea of an infographic like this, where the message is part of the image, that's key, and that really gets to the ventral pathways. This is a perfect example of working of visual learning. It's a very good example of visual learning because it shows you exactly visually what's going on. I don't need to explain it. You see it going on. This is an example of visual learning. And finally, this is an example of visual learning. If we can do this, if we can access visual learning and reduce the stresses on things like phonological processing by getting rid of all that writing, if we can reduce the stresses on working memory by stopping telling people, here's a rule, remember it and apply it. If we can do that, and if we can start being visual and saying to people, be constructivist, be creative, then what we're doing in the end is we're doing exactly those things that we identified, the University of Birmingham identified as being those things that are key to dyslexic learning success. It's really, really simple. And if anybody wants to know any of the references I used, we've got them there. So please, if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer your questions on this. Thank you very much.